Hi everyone, and welcome back. This is video 2 of the blood vessels chapter. In this video, we're just going to go over blood pressure and kind of what causes blood pressure, and then we'll talk about the ways that your body can control blood pressure. Okay? So very generally, the definition of blood pressure is just the force of blood pushing out on the walls of a blood vessel. All right, so that is blood pressure. And so we measure blood pressure in millimeters of mercury, right? That's just a unit for pressure. So when you take someone's blood pressure, you get that 120/80 number. That's 120 millimeters of mercury over 80 millimeters of mercury. Okay? And so pressure in the network of blood vessels is critically important because that is what causes blood to move. So blood moves from high pressure to low pressure. All right, so you would think, right, and we'll talk about some problems, but you would think why not just get the highest pressure possible, right? Keep that blood moving very efficiently. But that could have some downsides, and then we'll also talk in the next video about what happens if there's not enough pressure to move blood. Okay, so let's just talk about specific pressures really quick. So in the aorta, pressure is about 100 millimeters of mercury. All right, so that's coming right off of the heart. All right, so that aorta is receiving all of the forced blood and pressure from the heart. So it's going to have the highest pressure. And then that is going to filter down through the arterioles and then to the capillaries, where in the capillaries we have kind of between 35 and 25 millimeters of mercury. All right, and remember, capillary beds, kind of middle of the road pressure, but the slowest blood flow. We talked about that in the last video. So pressure and the rate of blood flow aren't necessarily connected. Okay, and then lastly, the blood will end up in the right atrium, right? So that venous blood coming back to the heart goes to the right atrium, and there the pressure would be 0 millimeters of mercury. All right, so what makes blood flow through the blood vessels? All right, we said it's pressure, okay? It's moving from high to low pressure. And so we kind of need to maintain a homeostasis of blood pressure. All right, that's something that's really important in the body, is keeping that blood pressure stable, because if the blood pressure gets too low, the blood doesn't move. All right, or it doesn't move efficiently. It depends on how low it is. Okay, so for example, if you have a stab wound or something like that, a gunshot wound, you're losing a lot of blood volume. That loss of blood volume will decrease blood pressure significantly, and that will cause a problem with blood flowing through the vessels. Okay, and so associated with this too low kind of side here would be shock, which we'll talk about in the next video, different types of shock. All right, and so then if blood pressure is too high, we know high blood pressure is not a good thing. And the reason blood pressure, being so high isn't good, there's a few different reasons. All right, it puts a lot of strain on the ventricles, especially that left ventricle. All right, and what happens is that ventricle hypertrophies. All right, so because it's having to push so much harder against that pressure to get blood out, it starts to get thicker and thicker. Just like if you lift weights a lot and you lift more and more weight, your biceps get larger, your heart will end up doing the same thing. It'll hypertrophy. But with the heart, that can't be maintained over an extended time. All right, so then eventually the ventricle fails. Okay, and so that would be a very serious problem. Okay, and then so that's in the heart itself, but high pressure in the vessels can also cause major problems. So in a vessel, high pressure over a long period of time could lead to a bulge in a blood vessel wall, and that's called an aneurysm. In a vessel wall. So that pressure just pushing on the wall of the blood vessel will eventually weaken it. It'll start to thin because of that pressure. And then you'll have these bulges in the vessel wall. And a problem with that would, maybe potentially, if it becomes thin enough, burst or rupture. And then you could have an internal bleed. But also with pressure being so high, you can have damage to the endothelium. All right, and we learned that damage to the endothelium can lead to clot formation, which would be really bad, especially if those clots broke loose and became an embolism, and we talked about that. Okay, so pressure homeostasis and keeping pressure stable is very important. All right, so pressure makes blood flow, but so does resistance, all right? And so resistance is the opposition to flow, okay? And so with these different kind of things that can affect resistance, I always like to think about them in reference to drinking through a straw, all right? So how easy is it to drink through a straw if you changed kind of these different aspects? That'll tell you how those different things might affect resistance in a blood vessel. Okay, so I'll talk about some examples, but I think that's the easiest way to kind of think about it. All right, so resistance is opposition to flow. Resistance will increase the further you get from the heart. Okay, so the further the distance, all right, the more resistance you get. Okay. All right. So factors affecting resistance. The first one is going to be viscosity. So viscosity is just the idea, how thick is the blood? Okay. As the blood gets thicker, the resistance increases and it's harder for that blood to move. That should kind of make sense. So think of drinking water through a straw versus drinking a milkshake through a straw. All right, much harder to drink a milkshake through a straw because it's so thick. All right, that's viscosity. Okay, and blood vessel length. So as you increase the length of a blood vessel, you're increasing the resistance. Okay, and so if you ever, when you're a kid, I know I did this with my brothers, connected a bunch of straws together and made like this really, really, really long straw, and then you try to drink through it, it is very, very difficult. And that's just because you've increased that length. That'll increase the resistance, making it harder to drink through. Okay, and so this is an important concept and kind of a reason why obesity, sorry, my word wasn't coming to me. Obesity is such a strain on your heart because as you add all that adipose tissue, you're adding blood vessels to that and you're increasing the length of the blood vessels, okay? And so that would result in an increase in resistance, which would put strain on your heart because it would have to pump harder to move blood through, okay? So obesity as well as gigantism, which we talked about with the endocrine system, right? That individual would have obviously a lot more blood vessels to go to all of their tissues. All right, and then diameter. So a wider blood vessel has a lower resistance than a more narrow blood vessel. All right, so it's, if you have like those little coffee stir straws, right? Drinking through that compared to drinking through like a smoothie straw, one of those really big straws that you can get, the really wide ones, much easier to drink through. Okay, so diameter can affect resistance as well and blood flow. All right. So there are two different types of pressure in the blood vessel. There's systolic pressure. So this is the pressure when the heart contracts. All right, this would be peak pressure also. So this would be the highest pressure. Okay? And then when the heart relaxes, the ventricles relax, that would give you the diastolic pressure. Okay? And so the vessels kind of recoil and relax. All right, so vessels recoil. All right, so you can actually feel that change in pressure going from that systolic peak pressure when the heart contracts to the diastolic relaxed pressure. You can feel that if you just, place your fingers over a blood vessel, and that is called pulse pressure, right? So if you take someone's pulse and you use your fingers over their blood vessel to take their pulse, you're feeling that pulse pressure, that difference between the systolic and diastolic pressures. Okay? And so then you can also calculate the mean arterial pressure for a patient. Again, on our exams, I don't have you do any kind of calculations, but you need to understand kind of what these numbers mean, okay? And so the mean arterial pressure, kind of like the average pressure in an artery. An important thing to understand with this is that it's going to be closer to the diastolic pressure. Okay, so we're going to take that pulse pressure, we're going to divide it by 3, and we're going to add it to the diastolic pressure. All right, and so that is going to put us much closer to our diastolic number. And so just for reference, pulse pressure is equal to the systolic pressure minus the diastolic. All right, so it's just the difference between the two. Okay, so if we had 120 as our number minus 80, all right, and that's, remember, millimeters of mercury, that would give us a pulse pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so pulse pressure is just the difference between systolic and diastolic, and so then we can plug that number into our equation. So if the pressure is 120 over 80, that individual's diastolic pressure would be 80. And then we just calculated that their pulse pressure is 40. Divide that by 3. And then we end up with 93.3 millimeters of mercury. And you can see that 93 is much closer to the 80, right, number, that diastolic number, than it is to the 120 number, the systolic number. Okay? And so the reason for that is because, as we talked about with the heart spends a much longer time, part of the cardiac cycle, in diastole than it does in systole. Remember, systole is only 0.3 seconds. That's constant. And then the rest is for diastole, okay? And so the reason for this is that the heart spends longer in diastole. So that average pressure would be closer to the diastolic number, because more of the time that's going to be the pressure in the vessel. Okay? All right. So let's talk about how blood pressure is controlled. Okay, so blood pressure control. So as we said, blood pressure homeostasis is very important. You don't want pressure to be too low. You don't want it to be too high either, okay? And so changes in blood volume can affect blood pressure. So increasing blood volume will increase blood pressure, right? Because you're just adding more fluid to those vessels, so that's going to push out more on the walls of the blood vessels. So a decreasing blood volume will decrease blood pressure. Okay? And so control of blood pressure comes in part, it's going to be hormonal, and in part it's going to be the nervous system. So we'll talk about the nervous system first. So there are cardiovascular centers in the medulla, okay? And so these cardiovascular centers will affect blood pressure by changing the cardiac output, okay? And so we talked about that in our last chapter with cardiac output. And so within these cardiovascular centers, all right, we have a stimulatory center and an inhibitory center. So the stimulatory center will activate the sympathetic nervous system. And so as a result, we'll get an increase in heart rate, right? An increase in contractility of the heart, right? And what we're most concerned about at this point, an increase in blood pressure, okay? So that stimulatory center acts through the sympathetic nervous system and will increase blood pressure. The inhibitory center will act through the parasympathetic nervous system, right? Particularly the vagus nerve. And that will function to decrease heart rate, decrease contractility, and decrease blood pressure, okay? So these two systems are going to be working in opposition to each other, all right? And then also in that cardiovascular center, there is a vasomotor center, okay? And so this vasomotor center is going to control, right? Vaso meaning blood vessel, motor referring to the smooth muscle in that wall. So it's going to control how constricted or relaxed that vessel is, okay? So this vasomotor center sets the baseline of constriction in that vessel, all right? That's the job of this center. So under normal conditions, how much constriction do we need on each blood vessel? And so then these other centers, the stimulatory and inhibitory, can alter that level of constriction. Okay, so the baseline is set by the vasomotor center, and then that baseline can be altered. For example, the sympathetic nervous system, if we increase its activity, that will cause constriction of those blood vessels and increase blood pressure. Okay, and then we can decrease input from the sympathetic nervous system and kind of reverse that. All right, okay. So now let's talk about some special receptors, and then we'll talk about hormones. All right, so receptors, you need receptors everywhere, right? They're going to detect the needs of the tissues, your brain, that kind of thing. They're also going to detect, we'll see, pressure, so we can help to maintain that homeostasis of pressure. So first, let's talk about chemoreceptors. So chemo, meaning that they detect different chemical signals. All right, these chemoreceptors are going to be located in the carotid the carotid bodies, right? Your carotid arteries in your neck, and the aortic sinus, so the aorta coming directly off of your heart. So the carotid, the sensors there are going to be monitoring blood to the brain. All right, what's the chemical makeup in that blood that's being sent to the brain? In the aortic sinus, the receptors there are going to monitor blood being sent out to your tissues, so your systemic blood. Okay? So what these receptors are going to detect are levels of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen. Okay, so an example, let's say these receptors detect a decrease in oxygen, an increase in CO2, and an increase in hydrogen ions. All right, so the response to this would be to increase activity of the stimulatory center, causing vasoconstriction and increasing blood pressure. All right, so this would lead to increase in the stimulatory center, which would lead to an increase in blood pressure, okay? Because this signal is saying this tissue, right, this blood, so going to either the brain or the body, doesn't have enough oxygen, right? It doesn't have enough, or it has too much carbon dioxide and too much hydrogen. So we need to get that blood moving around faster. Okay, so we're going to increase pressure. Okay, then we have the baroreceptors. So think like barometric pressure, right? Baroreceptors detect pressure. Okay, and so specifically in the blood vessels, they do that by detecting how much the wall of the vessel has stretched. So they detect stretch from changes, particularly increases in blood pressure. So as pressure increases, that wall, think of like filling up a water balloon, right? As you add more water, you're going to increase the pressure in that balloon, and it's going to stretch the wall of the balloon. Okay? So you're detecting the stretch on the blood vessel as a way of detecting pressure. So these baroreceptors are located in the same place as our chemoreceptors, all right? And so let's say if they detect an increase in blood pressure, which would mean an increase in stretch, that would cause a decrease in the stimulatory center and an increase in activity of the inhibitory center. All right, and then that would lead to a reduction of that blood pressure. Okay, so kind of like a negative feedback system. All right, and so one thing that's very unique about these baroreceptors, and if you're going into nursing or something, it's really important that you understand this. Even, if you have family members with blood pressure problems, it's important to understand this. And I've had to talk to my parents about this a little bit, is that baroreceptors can adapt to a new normal. All right. So they have the ability, baroreceptors have this kind of set, right? Like this homeostasis level of pressure that they like. All right. And so if the pressure increases above that, they're going to say, hey, something's wrong. All right. We need to bring the pressure back down. Or if it gets too low, they'll send out a signal saying, hey, the pressure is really low. We need to get it back up. Okay. So baroreceptors have a preferred pressure that they like, right? That homeostasis pressure. However, they can adjust to a new pressure that they like, all right? And so the reason this is really important to understand is when you give blood pressure medication. So if somebody has really high blood pressure, you give them a medication to help bring it down, these baroreceptors are going to resist that at first, okay? So what's going to happen is their blood pressure is normally high. That is the normal that these receptors are used to. When you give them a medication that brings it down, we're going to have kind of the opposite effect of this, right? So that blood pressure is going to go down. There's going to be less stretch on the vessel wall. So we're going to activate that stimulatory center in the sympathetic nervous system. So their heart's going to be racing. They're going to feel uncomfortable, anxious because their sympathetic nervous system is activated. All right. They're probably going to be sweaty and they'll just feel awful. All right. Until their baroreceptors can adjust to that new normal pressure that is lower. Okay. So it's important with patients, if you're putting them on blood pressure medication, that they understand you're going to feel really crummy for a while, but you need to give it time for your body to adjust to that new lower pressure, and then you'll feel much better. Because a lot of time patients that are put on blood pressure medication will feel terrible, and after just a few days they'll stop taking it because they just felt so bad. But if they stick with it, their cells will kind of adapt to that new, better, healthier, lower pressure, and then they'll feel much, much better. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting feature of those baroreceptors. All right, so now let's talk about hormones that regulate blood pressure. All right, so we talked about these obviously in our endocrine chapter, so we'll just review them a little. So renin is a hormone which we're going to also talk about again when we do the urinary system. All right, it is made by the kidneys. Whoops. Okay, made by the kidneys, and that's because the kidneys need adequate pressure. You'll find out when we do the urinary system, the kidneys have a lot of control over blood pressure. Quite a few of these hormones are associated with kidney function. All right, so the kidneys need adequate blood pressure in order to filter that blood to make urine. Okay, so they can release renin when pressure is too low to be making urine, and that will increase blood pressure. Okay, and then we have EPO, which will increase red blood cell production. All right, that would increase the viscosity of the blood, and then as a result, that would increase pressure. Okay, EPO also coming from the kidneys. All right, and then we have aldosterone. So aldosterone, remember, coming from the adrenal glands, will add sodium to the blood. Okay, and so it actually does this through the kidneys. All right, and so we'll add sodium into the blood. All right, water always follows salts. So this will increase the water in the blood, which will increase blood volume. And we said when you increase blood volume, you increase blood pressure. Okay, so aldosterone, by adding salt to the blood, will increase blood pressure. Okay, and then our last hormone is antidiuretic hormone, ADH. Okay, so ADH is just going to simply add water to the blood, right? It actually adds aquaporins into, the kidney, so water can move from the urine back into the blood. All right, so it's to the blood from the urine is actually what's happening here. So that's going to, again, increase blood volume, which increases blood pressure. Okay, so these are 4 hormones that can act to increase blood pressure. All right, so that's where we're going to stop on this video. So the next one we'll talk about shock, the different types of shock and what causes it. And then we'll wrap up by talking about exchange in a capillary bed and how that occurs, and a couple of other kind of topics to wrap up the chapter.